Every religion has had a problem with science, but the conflict of Orthodox Christianity with science has been the longest and the most bitter of them all. This conflict lasted for centuries. Many accounts have been written of this, but I think the best one, the most authentic one, was written about 120 years ago. The author is, as you can see, Andrew Dixon White, and the two volumes that he wrote are entitled A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology. He meant, of course, Christian theology. Dixon White went on to become the first president of Cornell University, which is quite amazing because you could never imagine that anyone who had written something like this would become the vice chancellor of a Pakistani university. Now, the conflict between science and Christian theology was not just limited to Galileo, as some people seem to think. These two volumes give example after example of how the church opposed the spherical earth. In the 6th century, Procopius of Gaza, a theologian, declared that the earth cannot have another side because for that you would need a second Christ, another duplicate Garden of Eden, another serpent, another great deluge, and so for all these reasons, the earth has to be flat. Well, fortunately, there were Christians who didn't believe this, and the great explorer Ferdinand Magellan wrote, "The church says that the earth is flat, but I know that it is round, for I have seen the shadow on the moon, and I have more faith in a shadow than in the church." Medieval Europe was visited by plagues, smallpox and cholera in particular, again and again, and this devastated the population of Europe. The church's response to this was that this was divine retribution. The people had sinned, and so they were being punished for their sins. But then science discovered the vaccine, that people could be inoculated against these diseases. The church was extremely angry at this because this was considered as a way of interfering in the way of God. So when Dr. Boylston invented smallpox vaccine, some religious fanatic threw a lighted grenade into his home. Now that reminds us so much of what is happening today in parts of Pakistan, where the polio worker, the person who administers polio drops to children and protects them from a lifetime of agony, is living at the very edge of life. So many of them have been killed. These volumes contain some fascinating episodes. For example, in 1770, there was a phenomenon that was observed in many places in Europe. It was seen that the streams in many places had turned red. Now, immediately the church declared that this was the blood of Christ and the wrath of God was visiting the earth. Now, at that time, there was a very eminent naturalist by the name of Linnaeus. Linnaeus looked at this water under his microscope and he found that they were little red insects. So he wrote up his paper, sent it to the Royal Society, and when it got published, there was a very strong reaction. He was accused of being inspired by Satan, that he had opposed the Holy Church, and that he was misleading people. Now, Linnaeus was not a very brave man, and he had seen what had happened to Galileo just a little while ago, so he apologized, he admitted that he was under the influence of Satan, and he withdrew his paper. The thunderbolt, said church dogma, was the result of 5 cardinal sins: incredulity, impenitence, neglect of repair of churches, fraud in payments of tithes to the clergy, and oppression of subordinates. Pope after pope expounded on this and said, lightning is the finger of God. And then in 1752, Benjamin Franklin flew his kite into the lightning storm and discovered that lightning was actually just electricity. And so, if you wanted to be safe from lightning, you put up a pointed conductor and the electricity would be safely conveyed down into the ground. Now, the church said that this is a way of putting an impediment into the works, into the way of God. But then it became so obvious that it was not prayers which would deflect lightning, it would be just this electrical conductor. The opposition would doubtless have lasted much longer, but it was discovered that in Germany, in the period between 1750 and 1783 alone, about 400 church towers had been damaged and 120 bell ringers killed by lightning. On the other hand, the town brothel was perfectly safe, although the church that stood opposite it had been destroyed by lightning. Dixon White's book has a fascinating account of Noah's flood, the Great Deluge, Christian theology, and the issues that science raised. As you know, God was very angry with mankind because of its evil ways, and he told Noah that he was going to drown everyone on earth. So he ordered Noah to build a giant ark, and Noah worked on this for many, many years. Then comes the flood, and everybody is drowned, but that Noah, his family, and all the animals would be saved. The problem that science has with this is that there are far too many animals for any conceivable ark to hold them. Then there was the issue of how long could these animals be fed? And so difficulty after difficulty was raised. There was no geological evidence that could be found for a flood that covered the earth. And so eventually the church had to concede, and this was after the Great Reformation, that this was perhaps just symbolic. It's very interesting, but this issue had reached the Indian subcontinent, and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who was a rationalist, looked at this issue and on the basis of the evidence declared that in the Quran, although Noah's flood is also discussed, yet this was something that had not actually happened. It was allegorical. This was a story that was made up for stupid people. And of course, people were very angry at Syed Ahmad Khan for saying this, but he stuck to his guns. This book is about medieval times, about Orthodox Christianity, but the lessons that it gives to us are so important even today. When science discovers facts and religion cannot accept them, then immediately the scientist is declared to be an atheist, an infidel, a non-believer. Even if he is not put to death, he is looked down upon with scorn. However, at the end, the truth has to triumph. This is why the Pope had to apologize for the Church's punishment of Galileo. In the end, it was true that the earth goes around the sun and not vice versa. And so whatever the objections that theology will put up, ultimately it is facts that will triumph.